Hi, welcome to the Hero Report podcast. My name is Ari Cohen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska. And with me, very early in the morning in Australia, is Matt Langdon. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Ari, how are you going?
Everything's good. Everything's good. It's afternoon here. You're ahead of us by quite a few hours. So you woke up early so we could have this chat, as is now our hopefully new routine. We'll see how many times I can make you get up early to have these kinds of conversations. But since the topic is heroism, something we both care about, maybe we'll have some success at keeping this going.
Should be a lot easier once school goes back. I can be up at a regular time.
There you go. Very good. Well, we decided to sort of quickly have a conversation today because we were chatting yesterday. And we got into a little discussion about heroism and people in your group and acting on behalf of those in your group and those who are not in your group, and thought that might make an interesting kind of one-off conversation. So where would you like to begin?
Well, let's start with what we mean by that group thing. I mean, evolutionarily, which is probably not a word. We're conditioned to help people that are like us. So that comes from living in small groups, tens of thousands of years ago, and our ultimate survival being tied to the survival of the people around us. So we're more likely to instinctually help someone that looks like us, sounds like us. And that's a real impediment to heroic action. So something that we probably don't think about, but that is there. So it's interesting to think about how we can overcome that hardwired reluctance to help someone different.
Yeah, I first ran across this, when I was working on my dissertation. I was reading a fair amount of evolutionary psychology literature. And the whole idea of kind of kin altruism, I think it was Trivers was the psychologist, the evolutionary psychologist who was writing about this decades ago. And I read some of that work and thought it was really, really interesting, right? That it's not just about sort of your own survival, but it's genetic survival, right? Is the theory for why you help people who are kind of closely related to you. And maybe it's part of why we're resistant or have been resistant in the past to talk about like the heroism of the parent who like does what we would consider to be normal parenting things. But your question, I think, is a really good one, right? How do you break through that barrier and kind of work on behalf of others, those who are not sort of immediately obviously related to you or part of your tribe or whatever kind of in-group it is you're thinking of. And the thing that sort of has spoken the most to me or gotten me the most interested is this concept that I think I first read when I was reading the philosopher Richard Rorty in college, and Rorty makes a kind of case for expanding the idea of who counts as one of us, right? And it seemed to me that there are some real benefits to thinking about things in the way that he talks about. Because at bottom, what he seems to be suggesting, the way that I've always read it, is this idea that we could eventually really work on expanding this sense of who counts, right? Who counts as one of us, or who fits into the definition of who we are, right? And for Rorty, the big idea is to think about this not in terms of a connection that's really broad and sweeping, right? Like we're all members of humanity, right? Or we're all brothers and sisters, children of God, something like that. Because for him, that's too broad. That kind of thinking can't carry the weight that we're talking about when we talk about heroic action, right? Because to step out of line and to do something dangerous on behalf of others, if you really have to think about that decision more than just a kind of immediacy, right? These are the different kinds of heroism that we've talked about quite a lot, but the one that requires a kind of a planning or a repetitive action or something like that, rather than a one-off in the moment action. If you want to do that, you need a kind of a real foundation, a reason to care about the other, that in a way that where it makes sense for you to put yourself at risk for them, right? And so that always really sort of struck me as being an important thing for us to think about, and perhaps something we haven't talked enough about, though we've certainly talked around it, right? When we talk about the concept of empathy and about expanding empathy, or expanding, I always call it in my classes, expanding our circle of care, right? So I think we've certainly talked in those ways, but maybe we haven't talked about it in this way.
Yeah, and it's I guess it's there are some classic examples of the sort of ongoing risk and heroism in helping others. Think about the whites who went down to Selma, or were on the or part of the Freedom Riders. The group that you were interested in talking about yesterday, or obviously interested in talking about yesterday, with the Christians who helped Jews in World War II. But obviously, obviously there's examples throughout the world of in times of I don't know, crisis, and especially violence against one group, that others step across. So it's that's the interesting part, is why that happens, and you've got some examples of that, but also some inspection of why that might have happened, other than it was the right thing to do, or it was the Christian thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people, look, the temptation, in general with heroism, we know the temptation is to say, oh, I didn't do anything particularly noteworthy, or I'm not a hero, right? This is where most people who do something noteworthy or heroic default to this statement, right? In the same way, I think most people default to the statement, it was just the right thing to do, or I couldn't imagine doing anything else, right? Those are the kinds of things that people say. But obviously, in the kinds of situations that we're talking about, right? And you can do this anywhere in the world where there's a requirement for heroism, where there's mass tragedy, or systematic abuse of human rights, or whatever it is we want to talk about that requires people to stand out from their society, whether it's Nazi-occupied Europe, whether it's apartheid South Africa, the American South during the era of Jim Crow. I mean, on and on and on, right? You find people lots and lots of people who don't stand out, right? Who go along. And so the people who say, well, it was obviously the right thing to do, for most people, it either wasn't obvious, or there was a more important factor pushing them in the other direction. And so, it's not that the people who are doing the wrong thing don't understand religion, or fail to see what the right thing is, or whatever, right? It's this idea, at least this is Rorty's theory, that the idea of our common humanity isn't strong enough, something stronger is required, and that kind of thing he talks about as personal identification, right? So you have to recognize that the other, the suffering other, is like you in some respect that you consider to be decisive, and something that is much more immediate than member of the human race. Yeah. And so, he gives these he talks about it in a kind of offhand way, right? As though, he hasn't really studied it. And he gets critiqued for that by other theorists. But, he says things like, what would have made the non-Jewish Danes or Italians rescue Jews during the Holocaust? Well, probably it was something like, this person was a member of my soccer club, or this person had young children like I do, right? I think that the historical record suggests that that there's a couple of ways to look at this. Yeah. On the one hand, like you say, most people will simply say, oh, it was my duty as a Christian, or it was the only way I could have responded. And then my suggestion is you have to dig a little bit deeper, right? With all of the people, and this is why I find research on heroism to be so fascinating, right? Because there hasn't been enough digging into the backgrounds of these people who do these really extraordinary things. If you dig into their backgrounds a little bit, you start to find potential reasons for why they did the sorts of things that they did, and things that might explain why other people don't. And those are the kinds of things that, in some sense, perhaps you can build on, right? So I always give the example of the village of Le Chambon in France, where people there was a kind of mass participation in Holocaust rescue during World War II. And it's I used this example when we talked yesterday, but the idea is that it's spearheaded by the pastor in the village, André Trocmé, and his wife Magda. And people say, well, that explains it, right? It's a religious movement, right? In some sense, a kind of dissent or disobedience spurred on by their understanding of what they're called to do by their religion. And that's all well and good, except there were lots of villages with pastors who didn't do anything, right? And I mean, some might have been outright collaborationists. I don't know. I haven't looked into ones that were. But certainly we know that there were lots of places that were not havens for Jews who were fleeing persecution, who were fleeing the Nazi extermination machine in the way that this village was, right? So you dig into it a little bit, and you find, in fact, that it's a Huguenot village, right? That these are people who have a very distinct experience with persecution, and in particular, religious persecution. So that when people who are being persecuted because of their religion turn up on their doorsteps, these are the kind of people who are far more likely to see them as people like them, right? People who are in a kind of similar need that their people have been in the past, right? And there's something about that, I think, that speaks to them, that makes them more open to a call to assist, right? To step out of line, to put themselves at risk, and to do what later they can say was simply the right thing, or that they were called to do because of Christian principles or whatever, right? So I think that this is the kind of digging that really interests me. I want to find out what it is that motivates different sorts of people, yeah? Because it's not going to be any one thing, right? Circumstances are always changing, and there has to be obviously something in your background, but then that means that heroism is something that's very, very contingent, right? It relies on all sorts of circumstances that ultimately we can't control. So then we have to do something else, yeah, beyond simply like looking at the stories and finding out who these people were and what in their background would have led them to do this particular thing in this particular situation. Then we have to say to ourselves, well, what can we do going forward? Because we can't like give everybody the experience of the Huguenots in that village.
Yeah, so I think I think any heroic action seems to have a group of possible triggers, I suppose, and I think one of those is that connection, whether it is being on the soccer team or even something as simple as wearing, the person that's being rescued or is the recipient of the heroic action is wearing a T-shirt of a band that you like, or something that creates that connection, right? I think the André Trocmé had a history of being interested in nonviolence and resistance as well. So there's that training of sorts that comes into it, but it is, and it's not always a trigger. And maybe we can get into that in a bit, but I think that it is this sort of, our goal is to create as many possible reasons for the heroic action as possible. So it is trying to get people to think about the other, but it's also getting people to be more aware of what's going on around them and all of that sort of stuff. But I remember reading in someone, you'll tell me the book in a minute, the Beautiful Souls, the stories around the Serbs and the Croats, and that people within the same family, and I think you'll probably give more examples of this too, but even having a family connection wasn't always enough to spark that heroic action, that selfless risk. So it clearly is a possibility. I think these things are all potential triggers, and we hope that they're going to work. But how do we reconcile those two things, where clearly a lot of people don't act for the people in the group, while others do cross that border?
Yeah, no, there are lots of examples of this from the former Yugoslavia, from Rwanda. I mean, you can find all sorts of examples of family members turning in other family members. This sort of thing, unfortunately, comes up quite often, because that pressure can sometimes be, I mean, obviously extraordinary, right? You seem to be standing against the whole might of your society, the government, and if there's any fissures in any relationship, it's possible to crack them. And if the incentive for an individual to perhaps bargain for a little more time for himself or herself, or trading one family member for all the rest of the family. I mean, there's all these sorts of problems that we see. And if we're seeing that, then obviously the challenge is really extreme, to say, well, how do you put your life and your family's life on the line for complete strangers, right? Well, because they're wearing a Metallica T-shirt, right? And you obviously really like Metallica, right? Well, that doesn't seem like it'll do it at all. This is a real puzzle. I have to be perfectly honest. It's a real puzzle. You bring up this idea of Andre Trocmé being kind of a resistor personality to begin with. And I think that there's something really important about that, because he's a galvanizing figure for the community, right? I don't know if any of those people, despite their backgrounds, if any of them would have done it alone, would have acted by themselves, right? But they have these people in their lives who are real kind of lightning rods, and they draw everybody in together. And so then, it's kind of an inverse bystander effect, right? Now to stand against rescuing is to stand against the whole village in some sense. So this, I mean, there's a real force associated with that, and he, it may be that he comes to that position of being a resistor and being an organizer of resistance as a result of his background. But you see these sorts of personalities over and over again in these situations, where people who are in some way trained or used to stepping out of line end up being a kind of force for kind of heroic action that we're talking about. And I mean, in some sense, there is a kind of I don't know if it's a challenge again, but there's something to think about in kind of encouraging that sort of behavior, right? Because it's typically, I mean, in a situation where there's where there's no problem, there's a level of deviance from the norm in just being a kind of person who always resists. That's a real complication, right? To be the person who always throws, kind of is asking the excessive question of whether we should do something. Was always kind of the force pulling in the other direction. The person who's always saying no that's a challenging kind of person to cultivate, right?
Yeah, and this is in danger of getting a little bit off topic, but that leadership piece is very interesting to me. When I speak to school groups about bystander effect, one of the things I bring up is there was a study by the New York Times, probably 5 or 6 years ago now, that broadly interviewed middle school and high school kids around the US, and found that bullying behavior was performed and received by over 50% of the student body, that it's not this this rare thing. But what they found was that mostly it was happening in the top half of the pecking order, the social pecking order. But at the very top of that social pecking order was a group, usually about 1% of the school, who were so popular that they didn't encounter bullying. And often they'd say to the interviewer that there wasn't any bullying at the school. And so they're in this position of authority, really, of leadership, and the potential there for them to change everything by through their actions. I think is a really powerful tool, and I feel like that's something that has happened here in this French village. That the people of Chambon were looking at this one person who said, "This is what we need to do," and they all said, "Go for it." And it's that. It's a really interesting position, and it's hard to take advantage of in a school, because we try to be so inclusive and democratic, and to say that, hey, there's probably 6 of you in this school that are respected enough and cool enough that you can change everything with your actions. It's not really a message that broad populations want to hear, but it's a real thing. Whether it's influencing the school buddies' interest in music or fashion, or it's changing the way everyone behaves, that power exists. And when you talk about a village of, I can't remember how many people were in Chambon, but that person or those couple of people can really influence the behavior of a group.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's something about that really sort of maps onto all of the stuff that we've been talking about, right? So it's not really that far afield, because one of the things that you have to think about when you think about kind of human rights activism or anything along these lines is that ultimately it's something that the powerful end up doing, right? And again, I keep coming back to Rorty in these discussions that we've been having, but this is the kind of thing that Rorty talks about in, when he talks about human rights, which is that at bottom, and there's something unsettling about this, I have to admit, a big part of human rights activism or human rights promotion is getting the powerful to recognize those who are not powerful, right? To recognize the suffering of others, and he makes it really explicit. He says something like, you have to get them to open their shriveled up hearts, turn their piggy little eyes to the needs of those that they normally wouldn't see. And what that means is that it's a process that probably takes a lot of time, and it's and really, I mean, it's sad because it relies on people who, at the time that you see the problem, may be nowhere near caring about it, right? But the question of how to get them to care about it is one that we've obviously spent some time thinking about, right? As we've been talking about empathy, and that's what what a lot of our work is starting to touch on, right? Which is this idea of showing people all of the other people around them, right? Getting them to be mindful of others, to recognize the people who are around them and how they feel and whether things are okay with them or not, whether other people are in need of assistance, and recognizing that you're the kind of person who can be of assistance, right? So, I mean, on the one hand, certainly this is a thing that the powerful, in the kind of large-scale situations that we're talking about, right? A whole school or a whole village or whatever. This is something where the powerful really have an inordinate amount of influence they might not know they have yet. They might not see the way that they can do something. But it's also something that on a micro level, on an individual level, everybody has the ability to really impact and really influence the life of somebody else, right? Because while it's true that a handful of powerful people could change a culture, any one person can have a direct impact on any other one person, right? By recognizing and doing something, taking action on behalf of someone else who is in need of assistance. And so, it works both ways, right? But it all ultimately comes down to this question of whether you notice the other person and whether you recognize the other person as someone like you, right? And when you say, this is someone who, if I was in this situation, I know how I would feel. I know what I would need. I hope someone would come to my rescue. I hope someone would help me. You know, and this is the kind of thing, again, that Rorty talks about. And he says that the way that you expand people's sense of empathy is by telling sad, sentimental stories, right? That ultimately, and this is where he sees the power of literature rather than philosophy, for example, right? That in fact, the study of literature moves us forward in great leaps in a way that thinking about these problems philosophically might not do, right? Because it's through literature that you really get this this direct experience of the position of the other, right? You put yourself into someone else's, not just shoes, but mind, yeah? And you get to sort of walk around in that person's head and think about what the day is like from the point of view of someone who is seems to be completely different from you until you are in that headspace and you recognize the similarities. Yeah? And so, you know, he uses Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I think in our quick discussion yesterday, I used Pride and Prejudice. These are you know, novels where a lot of the people reading it have a very different lived experience, right? Think of themselves as having a very different lived experience from the protagonists, and in walking around in that headspace for, you know, however long it takes you to read those books, you come to recognize the experience of that other person, and it becomes a part of what you now understand, right? And I think there's something really valuable about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a role there for, as documentaries are becoming more popular, to get into that space as well. I keep seeing people are all over the what is that crime documentary on Netflix at the moment?
The Making of a Murderer.
Yeah, the people are clearly feeling some empathy there for someone that probably wouldn't have before. You know, and that's the experience in Selma when White started going down to support that after seeing the beating on TV. And I think there's a you know, there's a lot of criticism of the media these days from all angles, but I think it's so clearly a role that the media plays in communicating the stories, and I feel like when Selma was happening in the 60s, that was a time when there was a lot less editing and you know, pitching an angle on stories on the news. It was more presented as news, and now we have, you know, there's a debate currently about who gets labeled a terrorist and who gets labeled a protester and who gets labeled a thug, and those things are really isolationist and prohibit people who otherwise might help someone from doing that. And it's there's a lot of power in the words we use and the decisions we make in our, whether it's our Facebook status updates or it's our media companies. The way that we talk about other people influences others.
Yes, absolutely, right. And it seems to me that this idea that, you know, people's motives are inscrutable, or we'll never learn about why someone did what they did. You know, this discourages people from, you know, trying to put themselves in the perspective of someone who's different from them. You know, whenever I teach about the death penalty, I always ask my students if they've ever been to a prison. It seems like a pretty straightforward question, but there's always a kind of surprise that I would ask them that, because why would they go to a prison? And I don't mean have you ever been locked up in a prison, but have you ever gone and, visited it, been inside the walls, heard the doors closing shut, talked to someone who is behind bars, and almost all of them have not, right? But everyone, I mean, and this is true if you ask anybody, especially in this society where there are a lot of people in prison, but most of the people that I spend time with, have to say, be people who have not spent time in a prison, right? But they all have lots of thoughts about prison and how prison should be and who should be there and for what length of time, and whether prisoners should have access to high school equivalency courses or exercise equipment or whatever, right? There's lots of opinions about those sorts of things from people who don't know any prisoners and have never been anywhere near a prison. But I'll tell you, your perspective changes when you know someone in prison, when you've been to a prison, when you've spent time talking in a prison to a prisoner. And so, you know, when I talk about these things, when I speak about criminal justice reform, or I speak about the death penalty, I always tell stories. I don't talk about statistics and facts and figures, because I'm absolutely convinced that facts and figures, none of that doesn't change anybody's mind. I can be 100% right? I can tell you exactly the facts and figures behind these things, but I also know that they will not convince anybody who believes the other side of the question. But stories have a chance. And digging into the people that we're talking about, the people behind the news item, right? Digging into the stories of, you know, I mean, Syrian refugees, for example, are much in the news, right? Digging into stories of Syrian refugees will make a difference in the way that just saying Syrian refugees and talking about their numbers and talk about vetting processes and whatever won't make any difference, right? It's always about digging a little bit deeper. That's often a challenge. It's often hard to do. Certainly, you mentioned the kind of environment now, whether it's social media or kind of conventional print or television or radio. I mean, it's much more challenging. You know, you need you can only do these things one story at a time, and you know, it's often expensive to do, and it requires a lot of commitment on the part of the person doing the reporting and the person doing the listening. I'm sure everybody, you know, this just comes into my head, and we should probably close in a minute here, but I'm sure everybody has an opinion on Bo Bergdahl, right? Who left his post in Afghanistan and was held captive by the Taliban for all those years. You know, people instantly, upon his release, came up with their hot takes on it and then put it aside, right? But now that he's the subject of the Serial podcast, right, now that all of those resources are going into telling the story in its complexity, it'll be very interesting to see what people think at the end of that, you know, series arc, right? But when you think about the amount of time and resources that are required to tell that one story in its complexity, it shows you the challenge, right? What it takes to really sort of dig into these things and potentially affect people, right? Really make a serious dent in what they think.
Yeah. Yeah, and it ends up becoming stories versus stories, whose story is more compelling. And that's, again, that's what media and big business is very aware of. They know that it's a story that sells and story that convinces. So yeah, it's I mean, I think at this point, our recommendation for people would be to put yourself in front of stories that you wouldn't otherwise experience. Look at books or movies or documentaries about people that are very different to you, to help expand that series of potential connections that you might find.
Yeah, and importantly, they don't have to be true, right? These don't have. I mean, the thing that I think is the most fascinating is that these don't have to be true stories. Fiction works just as well. Maybe it works better because it can be tailored to get you to see something that you might not ordinarily have seen. And so, reading literature about people who seem to be really different from you, I think is a good way to get some insight into really the linkages between all of us, and the fact that there's going to be some way, some way that will seem immediate to you, but that none of us could pick up on necessarily, in which people who you ordinarily would think are not like you will in fact turn out to be very much like you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's your homework today, is to go and find a story created somewhere else by someone else.
Right. Exactly right. Well, thanks, Matt. This was fun. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Let's keep pumping them out in 2016.
Yeah, without a doubt. We'll do this again soon. Thanks, everyone, for listening or watching, or watching and listening combined. We'll be back with you before too long. Have a good day.
Bye.